Hello, and the cacophony of small boys blending into the magical sound of the choir rehearsing sets the scene for this afternoon's festival of 9 lessons and carols, and certainly takes me back to my years at King's College, Cambridge. And I've just been thinking that when I was about the same age as these choristers, I was first made to sit down and hark to what certainly seemed like some herald angels singing. I'd always sung carols round the village, so the idea of actually paying attention to them on the wireless seemed an unnecessary exercise. And yet, even at that age, I was instantly aware of something mysteriously and distantly wonderful about what I was hearing. Indeed, as if the voices were divine and pouring forth from some unattainable planet. Many years later, and now almost 20 years ago, I myself joined the seemingly celestial choir and begun to realize that the divine experience was brought about entirely by humans, in fact carrying out their daily duties. 16 football-playing, shouting, normal small boys and 14 undergraduates combine, under the director of music and with the help of an organ scholar, to produce daily services in the chapel of King's College, where today, of all days in the year, world attention focuses on exactly that daily routine and elevates it to a level which few people would consider inconsequential. And yet, however much a pleasure it is, and believe me, it undoubtedly is, to sing in this building and in this service, these small boys are, for example, giving up Christmas at home. Now, does that mean only hard work, or is there an element of fun? The man responsible for the welfare of the small boys, Headmaster Gerald Peacock, has an answer.
It's great fun. The boys have parties with the headmaster, with the director of music in college, with games and excitements. They get presents from the college and from the school and from well-wishers of various kinds.
There used to be a tradition about a half-crown or a crown or something.
Yes, on Christmas Day, after the morning service, they go to the vice-provost's room and each boy receives a crown, a silver Churchill crown, with the boy who is usually the senior chorister, who has handed the roses to the altar at the Founders' Day service and the Founders' Obit service, getting an extra crown for each occasion. And they also get books from the vice-provost. Christmas Eve is fun because there's not only the lovely service with a tea party afterwards in college, but in the evening the boys prepare their bedroom for the headmaster's disguised visit with the Christmas stockings, in which he runs the gauntlet of booby traps set up in the darkness of the dormitory, staggers to the other end, yells "Pax," lights are turned on, and I distribute their stockings, and they then have a feast.
In fact, I wonder if the choristers enjoy this as much as the headmaster.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Headmaster dressing up, what sort of thing?
Yeah. Clobber him. We clobber him with pillows. Yes. We set traps for him.
You clobber him with pillows?
Yeah. We used to set water traps, but they normally fell on us, so now we just clobber him with pillows. Yeah.
This is another official activity, I gather.
Yes.
No.
Fairly. We push all the beds in front of the doors, before the doors.
When do you actually get home?
Christmas Day.
After Christmas lunchtime. After lunch.
Christmas.
What does it feel like actually not being at home for Christmas at all?
Well, after a while you get used to it. Yeah.
It's a bit. The first time I found it very sort of different not to be home for that. But when you've done it 2 or 3 times, you get used to it. Mm.
Well, they may get used to it, but away from Christmas, their life at school is basically straightforward, and they have to mix with non-chorister boys and even girls, and I often wonder what this kind of school must be like.
Numerically, the choristers and probationers are 24, and there are about 170 plus other children in the school, of whom about 40 are day girls. The day boys and boarders divide about equally, somewhere near 80. The relationships, although of course there are misunderstandings about the roles of different children among children, are very good. The choristers mix completely in terms of the dormitories they sleep in, the games they play, the classes they're in, entirely with the other children, both boys and girls, both boarders and day pupils. And I think, insofar as it can be so, it is a very good social mix.
Well, good social mix it may be, but boys have to be boys even when they're expected to be angels. And away from the chapel duties, they must enjoy, for example, a good game of football.
Well, I do enjoy sport a great deal, yes.
What else do you play other than football?
Well, I like playing rugby and hockey. I like all sport.
Any squash or tennis or any of those things?
I like tennis, but not squash much.
What's compulsory in the summer?
Well, the senior form has the choice of to do tennis or
Cricket?
Yes, cricket. Or swimming.
And you're standing around the field shouting your head off. You're still going to be able to sing later on.
I think so, yes.
Don't think it has any effect on the voice.
Well, I think it does, but we usually rest our voices before a major service. But as we're not doing something special,
And you reckon by tomorrow it's going to be back to normal?
I think so, yes.
You look as if you're shivering here on the touchline. Does it worry you being cold?
Well, I mean, like English weather, it's always cold.
What about the chapel? Isn't that can that be a bit cold in the chapel
Well, it
sometimes?
can be sometimes. Actually, in the winter it gets very cold. And of course, the organ pitch goes out a great deal when it's that cold.
So senior chorister Paul Smythe's first thoughts during this Arctic weather are for the pitch of the organ. Well, one man who knows all about choristers and temperamental organs is former chorister, former organ scholar and former director of music, Sir David Willcocks, now director of the Royal College of Music in London. I asked him to take us away from the ordinary and into the history of the Festival of 9 Lessons and Carols.
I think there's been the blend of continuity and change. I think if you ask the average person about the King's College service, they'd say it's the same each year, but in fact it's not. And the number of new carols introduced may be only 3 or 4 each year, but taken over a long period, I suppose the King's College Choir have sung well over 100 different carols in the last 30 or 40 years.
What do you think inspired Eric Milner White in the first place to construct this particular?
I think being a chaplain newly returned from the trenches, he found the Church of England service for Christmas Eve rather unimaginative, and he thought that he could devise something very much more exciting using a procession perhaps as well, which they did originally from the west end to the east end of the chapel. And he devised this service of 9 Lessons and Carols, which he based on an earlier service devised for Choral Cathedral. And in 1918, I think, it was first sung in King's, and that service ended with the Magnificat. In 1919, he removed the Magnificat, and the order of service was substantially as we have it today.
And you feel that what came out of the trenches over 50 years ago is still appropriate today?
I think very appropriate, because we need to hear the Christmas story retold year by year, and I think that the carols illuminate the text. And those who look carefully at the choice of carols will find that they are always related to the lesson which has just been read.
Well, the BBC has been broadcasting the service ever since 1928, and even through the years of the Second World War. And I wondered if any precautions were taken during those war years.
The security was such that they had to say that the service was coming from a college chapel. They never used the word King's College in case the Germans knew where it was coming from and might bomb Cambridge at that time.
Oh, right.
It was one of those conventions that you never said where it was coming from. The whole world knew perfectly well.
Well, the musical world, certainly.
The musical world would recognise the sound of this solo boy singing Once in Royal David City, and I think everybody was very amused.
But do things ever go wrong? I seem to remember an amusing incident concerning an organ scholar.
At the end of one lesson, he went, pa ta 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 ti ta 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 ti ta ta ti ta. There was a voice, Christ's birth and kingdom are foretold by Isaiah. And there followed the lesson. Then he had to play it over yet again after lesson, rather pianissimo. Pa, 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 pa.
That only goes to show how nerve-wracking it can be for an organ scholar, sitting all alone in the loft, far removed from the choir which he is accompanying. And I'm sure that the current organ scholar, David Briggs, must be feeling fairly apprehensive at this moment. I will remember a similarly worrying moment in my last year when I was to sing the solo in The Three Kings, which we're to hear again this afternoon. David Wilcock suggested that I should stand on my kneeler so that, head and shoulders above the rest of the choir, my voice would come over better on the microphone, which hangs above the choir stalls. Unfortunately, by the time in the afternoon when that carol appeared, it was already dark, and by standing on my kneeler, I suddenly found to my horror that my music was above the level of the candles, and I couldn't see a thing. So that's an anxious organ scholar and an anxious choral scholar. So what about 11-year-old choristers? Do they get nervous?
I think you do, really. You know, you feel so completely different. You've never sort of ever broadcasted anywhere else, and it's sort of to 1,000,000 people, say, you know, all over the world. It's sort of, if you make a mistake, right, you've had it, and it's really, you get so nervous. I did it anyway on my first time. But when you've done it a few times, you don't get so nervous at all.
How many Christmas Eves have you done?
3.
So this will be your 4th?
This will be my 4th, yes.
And there was a year before that you were a probationer that you knew about it, but you weren't
Well, I was a probationer for 1 term, because I was slightly older than some of the other probationers. So I went into the choir. And as somebody was ill on Christmas Eve, I went into one of the Christmas Eves as a probationer in my first term. But then I went into the choir as a chorister the next term.
And he did the solo. And the next year.
A touch of professional jealousy? So what do they do during the hour or two before the service itself?
Sit down and read a book.
Or watch TV or something.
Yeah.
Read an Asterix book.
Forget it.
Just try and forget
Yeah,
it.
it's not going to happen.
And then
Until
you,
2 minutes to 3.
well, when do you have to be at the chapel?
Well, half an hour before, I should think.
Just remind me what happens. Do you process right round the antechapel?
No, we don't. What we do is we go from the vestry and we just do a sort of round turn, and then we just sing what's
Under
the screen.
organ.
How does Mr. Cleobury choose who's going to sing the famous solo in Once in Royal David City?
Good question. No idea.
Yeah.
I think the voice has got to suit the microphone.
Yes.
It's got to suit what it's supposed to sound like.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Does it always have to sound the same, do you think?
No, it's just, but it's got to have the same sort of King's sound.
And that King's sound has been established and maintained over the last 100 years or so by only 5 people. Daddy Mann, Boris Ord, Harold Darke, David Wilcox and Philip Ledger. An amazingly distinguished lineup of directors of music, each of whom is represented musically in today's service. Now joined for this, his first year, by Stephen Cleobury, who is also distinguished brother Nicholas, is, by the way, married to my sister, the singer Heather Kay. Well, they said this should be a family show. What happens, apparently, is that when the boys are actually assembled under the organ screen at about a minute and a half after 3, the director of music points suddenly to one boy and says, "It's your turn," and away we go. I asked Stephen if it was ever thus.
I don't know how long that's been the system, but it seems to me to be a very good one. I think it has everything to be said for it, and I fully intend to follow that to the letter.
You think it reduces nervous tension rather than
I'm sure it
increases?
does, because, we had a carol service yesterday for the Cambridge schools, in which we do Once in Royal at the beginning, as we do on Christmas Eve, and I was able to see how the system worked. And indeed it seems to work very well, because then the boy hasn't got 2 or 3 days to get nervous about it.
Just got school lunch to get over.
That's right.
And the choice of carols is something you've obviously given a lot of thought to.
Yes.
Do you follow certain patterns, or what have you got?
Yes, I've taken the view that the pattern of the service has been so well established over so many years that there's nothing fundamentally to be altered, but just for the sake of variety, 2 or 3 different carols put in certain places, and 1 or 2 new descants.
The new music, Gordon Cross, John Taverner, Philip, obviously, with his connection. Do you have a special feeling for those 2 pieces, or what are they?
Apart from Philip's piece,
Yes.
you mean? Well, the Gordon Cross piece, that's called Letabundus, I found when I was thumbing through a book of contemporary carols that I'd had in my possession for some years. And I've always been an admirer of his music. I like this carol, and I've juxtaposed it with a medieval carol, Angelus ad Virginem, because it seems to me to show a link with that ethos. John Taverner's piece, a setting of William Blake's The Lamb, was one of the many which was received by us through the post during the autumn. They come virtually daily, as you can imagine.
Yes.
And I do look at them all, although not all in quite as much detail as others. You very soon gain an impression of what it's going to be like. And I remember propping this up on the piano and playing it through and being immediately struck by it. People who know other music by John Taverner may find the thought of a carol by him taking place in this carol service somewhat surprising.
Yes, I was surprised to see his name on the list.
But indeed, you will find that this carol is simplicity itself, and very, very haunting.
The Philip referred to is in fact my old tutor, Philip Radcliffe, who's written a new carol called The Oxen for today's service. And he remembers listening to the first ever broadcast of this service in 1928, interrupted as it was by a performance of Madame Butterfly, which was coming live from Paris in the days when broadcasting was somewhat less refined. Apart from the small boys, the director of music, and the carols themselves, there are 14 young students described as choral scholars by virtue of the duties they must carry out every day in the chapel. And they make up the lower voices of the choir, 4 altos, 4 tenors, and 6 basses. This year's senior choral scholar is Rory Phillips, by no means a newcomer, as he sang here as a boy chorister.
This year will in fact be the 6th Christmas Eve service I'll have sung.
Quite a lot of old choristers come back these days.
Well, at the moment there are 2 of us, and in my first year there was another, so there have been 3 since I've been here.
And you weren't particularly nervous as a boy?
No, not really.
Were you nervous as a gentleman?
Very.
Really?
Yes.
The feeling of responsibility is much greater.
Yes, in my first year I was very frightened indeed. Slightly less so last year, I don't know about this year.
What about the music for this year's service? Of course, you have a new director of music, so do you speak to him about choir favourites or dislikes or anything?
No, that's entirely his own choice. But we seem to have come up with some very interesting pieces this year.
Quite a lot of contemporary material, and you think the mixture of the new stuff and the traditional is the right approach?
Yes, I think that'll be very effective. I mean, I'm a great admirer of Harold Darke's In the Bleak Midwinter. And
another old Kingsman, of course.
Exactly. This is a version where you hear the boys sing the first verse of the carol, and then the full choir, unaccompanied, and then a tenor solo, and finally the choir coming in very quietly again.
It's got everything, really, isn't it?
I think so, yes.
And a bit of organ tinkling away in the background.
That's right. It's very effective in that sort of building.
But apart from the carols, there are, of course, the 9 lessons, the cornerstones of the service. A service which is, in fact, a gift to the people and city of Cambridge. One of those lessons has to be read by the Mayor of Cambridge, this year Peter Cowell, a postman by trade, who this morning will have been up as usual at 4 o'clock in the morning, delivered his round and then gone on, as he does every day, to take up his duties as Mayor. But today his duties include broadcasting a lesson, or service as he calls it, all around the world.
I'm a great sentimentalist over Christmas. I love Christmas lights, I love Christmas carols, I love the children's running about, and the Christmas Eve carol service from King's is the top. As far as reading the service, I went along on Tuesday this week to a similar sort of service, but for the school children, and I had to read a service there. And believe me, it was bitterly cold in King's College Chapel, and I was freezing. Although I was dressed up in all my regalia, I was freezing right up until the time when it came to me to stand up and walk to the lectern and give my service. And then I've become desperately hot for some reason or other, you know. It's very daunting, but you can't help but be, you know, impressed and overpowered by the whole thing in King's College. I mean, it's a beautiful place. The singing is superb, and, you know, the fact of being involved, although it's a bit daunting, as I say, when I think to myself it's going out possibly all over the world, I'm looking forward to it. I think it could be one of the highlights of my mayoral year.
Another important feature of the college's involvement in this service is the reading of a lesson by the Provost, Bernard Williams, who's now done this for several years. And I wonder if repetition makes such a job difficult.
I think the thing about that particular text is that it is so complex and interesting that it never comes out quite the same on any 2 occasions.
You've always got to be thinking about it.
Something else that it means, yeah.
Christmas Eve service,
Yes.
through the medium of radio and television, obviously brings the name of King's College
Yes.
right throughout the world every single year. Is the chapel and its choir as important to King's as it is to everybody else?
Yes, it certainly is. That doesn't mean, of course, and it would be wrong to pretend that it meant, that, as it were, all of the fellows spend a great deal of their time going to chapel, because obviously, like any other college or any other institution, people who are fellows of the college, indeed students of the college, have a whole variety of views, and not everybody is a churchgoer. The chapel is an immensely important part of our life, and so, of course, is the music of the chapel.
And they don't feel that for an academic institution that the fame that the college receives through its music is a little imbalanced.
No, they don't feel that. And indeed, I think that everybody in this college feels that the level of excellence that's represented by the choir and the music that's associated with the chapel is itself the sort of achievement that a college ought to be interested in. It isn't just that we've got a kind of thing stuck onto us which is part of showbiz or something. I mean, it is itself, after all, an achievement of the very highest artistic kind, of which we properly feel both proud, I think, and identified. I mean, there are certain features of the fame of the chapel and its choir which obviously don't make life easier for anybody. One of them being a very large number of visitors who have to be, in one way or another, received and welcomed, we hope.
Of course, one has to admit that any kind of nuisance value is possibly outweighed by the income. And
Well,
I know
yes.
that at the moment there is a tremendous appeal on for the chapel itself. Perhaps you
There
could
is
tell us.
indeed an appeal on, and of course some people, we've got to raise £1 million in order to mend the chapel, its exterior architecture. The appeal is simply for the fabric of the
The
chapel.
care of the provost, King's College, Cambridge would do, wouldn't it?
It would certainly do, yes, all care of the chapel appeal. And the thing is that people have asked us why we don't charge for admission. And we've made an absolutely deliberate decision not to charge for admission because we think it's unsuitable to the place, both as a place of worship and as a place of beauty, that people should be having to sell tickets and buy tickets to get into it. But of course that does mean that we have all the more need for monies anybody's willing to send us.
Well, there may well be an appeal for £1 million, but it's been said that chapel cleaner Mrs. Bowers is worth her weight in gold. Ever since 1962, she's cycled in each day and put her heart and her feather duster into keeping this wonderful building spick and span. How long, I asked her, does that actually take?
I work till 8 till 12:30. I clean the chapel and I look after the vestments and I take the communion cloths home, and see after all the books and things.
What will you actually be doing on Christmas Eve yourself? Will you be working?
Well, I'll be here in the morning. I go home, when the choir's sort of practising and there's nothing more I can do, So the service means a great deal to me, and if I can get there Christmas Eve, I will do.
Do you go every year?
Not every year.
There are very
When
few
I'm
people in the
able to.
world who get tickets. You're obviously very
Yes,
important to the
yeah.
college.
I love the chapel very much. I think the carol service is just marvellous.
So moving out of the chapel now, we find a queue of people already stretching way round the front court of King's. It's a greyish morning, but reasonably warm, reasonably mild, and some of these people have been outside here for many hours and many days. We're going to have a little talk with one or two of them now. Right at the front of the queue are two people who've been sleeping out since 5 o'clock yesterday morning,
That's correct, yes.
but not for the first time.
No, it's our third year running that we've come at that sort of stupid time.
It's insane. And it's been very cold. It was very cold last night.
It was very cold. And it was raining at sort of
Yeah.
3 in the morning, and it was horrible this morning, but
You're looking very peaky, if I may say so.
Morning, would you like some champagne?
It's a lovely idea. It's a bit early. How long have you been drinking champagne?
Well, not since last night.
Are you going to be compos mentis when the service begins?
I hope so. Yes, hope so. That's
Now,
the idea.
you're not all English, are you? We have a French person
Yes,
here.
I'm a bit French.
Where have you come from for the service?
From Cannes.
You have a good reason for being here, don't you?
Yes, I have a brother-in-law singing.
In the choir. How do you think he's feeling at the moment?
I don't know, maybe not as cold as me.
Nobody in the queue has yet said anything religious, and now they're starting to sing. I went and asked John Drury, the Dean of King's, what he thought about the religious aspect of the service.
I'm not one of those who subscribes to the exclusive choice service or concert. I mean, I hear it a good deal. Is this a service? Is this a concert? I think the two are not as far apart as all that. And if people come for the music, I think that, as it were, the worship is there as well.
Well, I must point out that this remarkable choir of young men and boys does sing a service in this glorious building on most days of the year, excluding holidays. And in some ways, today is just another day in the life that they must lead. When I arrived in Cambridge yesterday, just 24 hours before the service this afternoon, I might have expected the boys and men to be sitting in a dimly lit room, wrapped up and protecting their valuable voices. Far from it. There was actually a football match taking place between the choristers and the choral scholars in freezing conditions, at a far cry from the religious and musical surroundings in which they are normally seen and heard. Senior choral scholar Rory Phillips sums up for us what all this means.
I suppose, in a sense, my religious feelings have been, to a great degree, shaped by King's Chapel. And so, to me, it's a very important occasion. It's one among many during the year. But I think it's an extraordinary opportunity to send out a religious service right round the world.
And you think that's as crucial as the musical element, which of course is the one thing that is particularly talked about.
Yes, and on another level, I mean, for many people, I think that when they hear the beginning of the service from King's at 3 o'clock on Christmas Eve, it is the beginning of Christmas.
Christmas at King's was presented by Brian Kay and produced by Caroline Elliott.